Today I want to share with you how to make a whole grain Einkorn date nut bread using fresh milled flour. Hi sweet friends! If we're meeting for the first time, I'm Mary from Mary's Nest, and author of the Modern Pioneer Cookbook and the Modern Pioneer Pantry, and I'd like to welcome you to my kitchen. Today I'm continuing my series on how to bake with fresh milled flour. Now, if you missed the first video in this series, don't worry. I'll be sure to put a link to it in the description underneath this video. And go ahead and watch that after you watch this video. There's been a lot of interest lately in learning how to bake with fresh milled flours. And the reason that we want to bake with these type of flours is because they're very nutritious. But there are some little differences that you need to learn when baking with fresh milled flours as opposed to flour that you buy from the grocery store, whole grain flour specifically from the grocery store, or flour that you did fresh mill at one time but has been stored for a while. Fresh milled flour is a little thirstier than other flours. Plus, when you bake with ancient grains like we're going to do today, einkorn specifically, einkorn, as well as emmer and spelt, two other ancient grains, absorb liquid a little differently. So you kind of got to even everything out, but don't worry, I've got a recipe here for you that's going to work out perfectly. Now the first dry ingredient we're going to need is 2 1/4 cups of fresh milled flour. Now, when you grind grain, about a cup of whole grain is going to equal about 1.5 cups of flour. So just keep that in mind when you're going ahead and measuring out your whole grain. Now don't worry, if you have a little extra flour, you can just go ahead and store that in your refrigerator or your freezer. You can even store it at room temperature for a few days, but I generally recommend refrigerating it or freezing it after a few days because the oils that are naturally occurring in whole grain can start a process of becoming rancid over time. Now, it's not going to happen after a few days, not even necessarily a few months, but there is oxidation, which is the damaging, in essence, of the nutrients in the whole grain. So best to refrigerate it or freeze it to maximize preserving the nutrition in your whole grain. The additional dry ingredients that you're going to need to make this whole grain einkorn date nut bread, that's a mouthful, are 2 teaspoons of baking powder, 1/2 teaspoon of baking soda, 1/2 teaspoon of a fine ground salt. You can use table salt, you can use the fine ground sea salt, that's what I like to use. You can use a fine ground version of the Redmond real salt. Any fine ground salt that you have will work fine in this recipe. And the remaining dry ingredient that you're going to need is 1 teaspoon of cinnamon, ground cinnamon. For the wet ingredients, I like to use 1 cup of buttermilk. Now, if you don't have buttermilk, don't worry. You can use milk to which you add a tablespoon of like an apple cider vinegar or other vinegar. Apple cider vinegar works very well. And you just want to bring everything up to 1 cup. You could also stir in a tablespoon of kefir into some milk, and I like to use whole milk when I'm doing this. You can also stir in a tablespoon of yogurt to whole milk. Or if you have cultured sour cream, you could use that in the whole milk. Basically what you want to do is try to use some sort of cultured dairy in this baking process. And the reason is cultured dairy helps make a tender baked good. But if you don't have any of those additional ingredients on hand and all you have is some milk, that'll work fine. You can just use 1 cup of whole milk. Next, you're going to need 1/2 cup of unsalted melted butter that has been cooled. Next, you're going to need 2/3 cup of maple syrup or honey. Now, I like to use maple syrup and I use the dark maple syrup. I don't really notice the flavor of maple coming through in my baked goods, quick breads like what we're doing today, whether it's muffins or an actual loaf quick bread. I don't notice it, but even if I did, I really like maple syrup, so it's okay with me. If you don't like the taste of maple syrup, then by all means go ahead and use honey. I don't use honey because most of the honey that I stock in my pantry is raw honey, and I'd rather not heat that. But that's totally up to you. Just 2/3 cup of some type of liquid sweetener, and in this case, the maple syrup and the honey work very well. Now, an interesting sweetener to try, especially since we're making a date nut bread, could be date syrup. I have not tried that yet, but if you try it, let me know in the comments below what you think. And then all you need are 2 more ingredients for the wet ingredients: 2 large eggs at room temperature and 1½ teaspoons of vanilla extract. And for your mix-ins to make this a date nut bread is going to be 1 cup of chopped pitted dates. I like to use the medjool, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, medjool dates, and I buy them already pitted, and then I just chop them up. And then in addition to that, 1/2 cup of nuts. Now, generally, I believe in date nut bread. Walnuts are somewhat traditional. I live in Central Texas, and we have an abundance of pecans here. And so since they're easy for me to get, in essence, locally, I think of anything in Texas as local. But so I always use pecans when nuts are called for in a recipe. So I'm going to be using 1/2 cup of chopped pecans, but by all means, 1/2 cup of walnuts will work wonderfully too. Now, before we even get started milling our grain and mixing our dry ingredients and then mixing in our wet ingredients, the very first thing we want to do is go ahead and set our oven to 425 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, I know if you're an experienced baker, you're going to think that's kind of a high temperature to bake a loaf quick bread in, and especially one that's made with 100% whole grain flour, and you would be 100% right. We're only going to bake our quick bread at 425 degrees Fahrenheit for 5 minutes. It really helps to give a good oven spring when you're baking with einkorn flour especially, and just whole grains in general. But then we're going to turn our oven heat down to 350 degrees Fahrenheit for the remaining of the bake time. And that also works very well as opposed to 375 degrees Fahrenheit, which you may see a lot of quick breads calling for in terms of temperature. But when you're baking with 100% whole grain flour, pulling the temperature down to 350 degrees Fahrenheit allows your quick bread, in this case our date nut bread, to bake completely, to bake beautifully inside and beautifully outside. So you'll get a nice golden, in this case, the date nut bread does tend to be on the darker side, but it should be like, let's say, golden brown on top. And inside will be thoroughly cooked. The top won't be burned, the inside won't be raw. 350 degrees Fahrenheit is your perfect temperature for baking a whole grain loaf type bread. Now we'll start mixing our batter in a minute, but first of all I just want to mention that since we are baking with fresh milled grains, you do need a grain mill. And I've got a Mock Mill 100, but any electric grain mill you have will work fine, and any manual grain mill you have will work fine. The bottom line is we just have to grind our grain. And since we're making quick breads, if your grain mill allows you to adjust how the grain will be ground, you want to set your grain mill on the finest setting. And on my Mock Mill 100, that's the number 1. That's going to give me a nice, finely ground flour. Now next you're going to need a loaf pan that measures approximately 9 inches by 5 inches. And you're going to want to line this loaf pan with parchment paper if possible. If you don't have parchment paper and you're going to need to grease this loaf pan, do it very little. You want to really spread the butter out that you grease your pan with, or if you use one of those sprays, you really want very, very little fat greasing your pan. And the reason is einkorn flour, not only does it absorb liquid differently, it also absorbs fat differently. And you don't want to add any extra fat if not necessary. And that's why I recommend the parchment paper. So If you don't have it, just very gently, or very lightly, I should say, put a coating of butter or some sort of oil spray, whatever you use, but you just want to make sure that it's very light. I can't stress that enough, because you're going to learn as you go through the process of not only baking with fresh milled grains, but also baking with ancient grains like einkorn, emmer, and spelt, that they absorb fat differently, and einkorn especially. And you can always tell when you've added too much fat, because when you go to remove your quick bread or your muffins from a muffin tin, they're greasy because the einkorn wasn't able to absorb all the fat. So that's just a little tip I wanted to share with you. If you find that you like baking with einkorn because you find it more digestible than modern day wheats, it's not gluten-free, but the gluten is a little more, I guess you would say, gentle than the gluten in modern day wheats. It's a little different, and not people who need to eat gluten-free, but people who may just be a little sensitive to gluten find einkorn agrees with them. It's not gluten-free, but as I said, many people find it more digestible. It's also a very nutritious flour. It almost has a little bit of a yellow color to it because it's very high in beta-carotene, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, the precursor of vitamin A. So something to think about if you find that you really like einkorn and you really want to bake with it on a regular basis, and you're going to be making quick breads, invest in some parchment paper and some muffin tin liners if you like the idea of making einkorn muffins like we did in the previous video. Now we're going to grind our einkorn, and this is known as whole grain einkorn, einkorn berries, sometimes einkorn wheat berries, and approximately 1 cup of whole grain will yield approximately 1.5 cups of flour. However, there's always some variability in that because the size of the grain will play a role in that too. Einkorn is relatively small, emmer is a little bigger, spelt is even a little bigger than that. But the general rule is that approximately 1 cup of whole grain will yield you about 1.5 cups of flour. Now I'm going to go ahead and put my einkorn in here, and I'm just going to go ahead and grind 2 cups because I'm going to do some other baking as well, and so I can use all of this fresh milled flour right away. Now I'm just going to put the lid back on the hopper. We've got it set on number 1, which is going to make the finest grind of the flour, and that's very good for quick breads and muffins. Okay, here we go. So we've got our fresh milled einkorn flour here. I'm just going to go ahead and set this aside, and when we're ready to mix all of our dry ingredients together, I'll measure out 2¼ cups. I'm just going to go into this bowl and scoop out my first cup of flour, and I'm just going to use a knife to level it off and go ahead and put this in my bowl. Now I'll get the remaining 1¼ cups of flour for a total of 2¼ cups of flour. Now we're going to add the remaining ingredients, the dry ingredients, to our freshly milled whole grain einkorn flour. And what I've got here is the baking powder, and then next we'll go ahead and add in our baking soda, just a little bit there, and then we'll go ahead and add in our fine ground salt. Perfect. And last but not least, our ground cinnamon. Now I'm just going to take a whisk and whisk all the dry ingredients together so that the baking powder, the baking soda, the salt, and the cinnamon are well distributed amongst this whole grain flour, this einkorn flour. Cinnamon smells really nice. Now that we've whisked our dry ingredients together, I'm going to set these aside and we'll mix our wet ingredients, and then we'll add them into our dry ingredients. Now before we mix anything, I want to go ahead and put the parchment paper into my loaf pan. And again, if you don't have a loaf pan, just be real gentle or light-handed with the butter. Now all I'm going to do is just put a little dab in here just to help hold the parchment paper in place. And then another tiny little dab just along the sides. Again, this is just working to keep the parchment paper in place. Now I just eyeball all of this. I'm not very exact. You really don't have to be. But I'm just going to cut one long strip like this, which I'm going to use to put into the baking pan this way. So this will give us a sling one way, and then we're going to take this remaining piece and it's going to give us a sling the other way. Something that I recently saw, I think in a YouTube video, I can't remember exactly, but it was really neat that they're making parchment paper now that has like, it's already made like a sling. Very interesting. But parchment paper, big sheets of parchment paper are generally very reasonably priced, so it's just as easy to cut it and make the slings yourself. Now I'm going to go ahead and set this aside, and I'm going to bring back our dry ingredients. And the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to add in our mix-ins or our add-ins, our dates, our chopped dates, and our chopped nuts, in my case pecans. And the reason I like to do this is twofold. Number one, I always like to dust anything that I'm adding into a batter. It helps it be more equally distributed throughout the batter as the quick bread or the muffin bakes. Everything doesn't kind of sink down to the bottom. But number two, when working with the ancient grains, especially einkorn, you have to be really careful to mix very gently just until the dry ingredients are moistened. Now that's kind of a traditional rule with quick breads, just until the ingredients are moistened, but you need to be especially careful about this with einkorn. It really doesn't like to be overmixed. And so I would rather add in my mix-ins now rather than adding them in later, even if I did dust them if I removed a little bit of the flour beforehand and dusted them and then added them in after I added in the wet ingredients, because that's additional mixing that I really don't want to do with einkorn. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add in our chopped dates. Very sticky. And then I'm going to go ahead and add in our chopped nuts. Then what I'm going to do, especially since the dates are sticky, I'm actually going to get in here with my hands and make sure that the dates are not clumped, that they're all equally distributed. And I'm just going to start working them into the flour with my hands. Once I feel that the dates and the nuts are well coated with the flour, especially the dates, and that they're separated into their chopped pieces, because I don't want to get any clumps. And once I get all of them tossed nicely with the flour, what I'm going to do next is just make a well in these dry ingredients, and then I'm going to set this aside and we'll mix our wet ingredients. Now I'm going to use a large measuring cup. You can certainly use a bowl, whatever you have. But the first thing that I'm going to do is go ahead and add in my buttermilk. Perfect. I want to get every last little bit. Next I'm going to go ahead and add in my melted butter that I've allowed to cool. Then my maple syrup. And after we get the maple syrup in, I'll go ahead and add in our 2 eggs. Wonderful. And then to that, we're going to add in 1½ teaspoons of vanilla extract. I think this is a half teaspoon measure, so I'll add 3 of these. Now I'm going to whisk all of this together just with a small whisk until everything is well incorporated, and I know for sure that those egg yolks are completely broken up and well emulsified into this mixture. Now I'm going to go ahead and add my wet ingredients into that well that we made in our dry ingredients. Now it's time to mix all of this together, and as I said, we're just going to be very gentle about all of this, and we're going to mix just until the dry ingredients are fully moistened. My mother made a lot of date nut bread. Now, mind you, she didn't have einkorn flour, but she would make it with whole wheat flour. And I really love date nut bread. She would slice the loaf pieces into about 2 inches by about 1 inch. And then she would slather them with a nice thick layer of cream cheese, and then put another little piece of the date nut bread on top, and it would make like a little tea sandwich. They were some of my favorite. Alrighty, this is looking good. As you see, I didn't really have to do a lot, just a little bit. I just want to get in here and make sure we get all of the dry ingredients incorporated. Now I'm going to take this and put it right into our loaf pan. As you see, it didn't take a lot of turns to get all the dry ingredients incorporated. And once I get this into the loaf pan, we're going to let it rest for 5 minutes. That is a good secret when working with ancient grains, especially einkorn. Normally, you would just smooth out a quick bread because you're using, baking soda and baking powder, and you want to get it in the oven fast. But it's funny, these ancient grains are a little different. You want to give everything plenty of time. You want to give the grain plenty of time to completely absorb any liquid and fat, or as much liquid and fat as it can, before baking. And about 5 minutes is a general good rule of thumb. Alrighty, I got that all in there. Now, once you get it in the pan, I just like to use a little spatula. You can use an offset knife, like an icing knife, whatever you have, and even the larger spatula. And you just want to smooth out your batter. Make sure you get it into every little corner, and then just smooth out the top. Now, one thing I want to mention, because we're going to let this rest for 5 minutes before we put it in the oven. This way we make sure that we've given the einkorn plenty of time to absorb the liquid and the fat. But what I want to say is, now you'll notice this is a light colored date nut bread. You may also see date nut breads that look very, very dark, almost like chocolate. You can make that as well. The only difference is I use 2/3 cup maple syrup because we enjoy the lighter colored date nut bread. The flavor is a little milder and my husband enjoys that. But if you like molasses, you can do the whole 2/3 of the liquid sweetener with molasses. Now, I recommend just using the regular molasses and not the blackstrap molasses, unless you really like that very strong, but sometimes considered bitter flavor of molasses, but just using the regular molasses, and you can go with the 2/3 cup, and that'll create a very dark molassesy flavor, if that's a word, molassesy flavor of the date nut bread. Alternatively, you can do 1/3 maple syrup or honey and 1/3 of the molasses. And that will also make a dark colored bread, but the flavor will be a little more mild. Now, as we give this 5 minutes to just rest a little, I want to share with you 2 books that are very interesting if you find that you really like learning about baking with fresh milled flour. One is the Essential Home Ground Flour book, and this is by Sue Becker of the company Bread Beckers that sells grain and grain mills and so on and so forth. And Sue shares a lot of information about why we want to bake with fresh milled whole grain flours, the nutritional benefits, so on and so forth, as well as she also shares recipes. So it's very interesting, and there have been a number of podcasts lately that she's been on that were absolutely excellent, and I'll be sure to link to those in the description below. But she's a wealth of knowledge. And then the second book that I found very interesting is the Fresh Milled Flour Bread book. And it's by an owner of the Lyman Avenue Bread Company, I believe. And his name is Tim, and please forgive me, Tim, if I am pronouncing your last name wrong. Gayufi or Giyufi, I'm not 100% sure, but this is a very interesting book because it kind of goes one step beyond what Sue Becker shares, and it's a little more gourmet. Sue has wonderful recipes, a lot of everyday breads and whatnot, but in the fresh milled flour bread book, there are artisan sourdoughs and pizza and croissants, and as he says, and more. I like that, and more. So definitely be sure to check out these two books if you find you really enjoy baking with fresh milled flours and the benefits that they can bring to your diet. Alrighty. Well, we're going to get ready to put this into our 425 degree Fahrenheit preheated oven. Don't forget that. We're going to leave that in there for 5 minutes, and then we're going to pull the heat down to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. Don't open the oven door. And a bread like this, a loaf bread like this, made with whole grains and baked at 350 degrees Fahrenheit, which will allow it to be a nice golden brown on top, yet fully baked in the middle, with no burning on top and no raw dough in the middle, or raw batter in the middle, will take approximately 55 minutes, maybe a little under, a little over. But what is wise to do is keep an eye on it at about 50 minutes. Look at how it's browning on top. And if you feel it looks like it's done, go ahead and use a toothpick to check. Put the toothpick into the middle of the bread and then pull the toothpick out. If the toothpick comes out dry or with like just a few dry crumbs, your bread is done. If it comes out and it's still a little damp on the toothpick, then leave it for another 5 minutes and check it again. You may also need to go a little past the 55-minute mark. You may need 60 minutes. But in general, somewhere between 50 and 60 minutes, this will be done and ready to enjoy. Now, the reason we put that quick bread, the date nut bread, into the oven at 425 degrees Fahrenheit is because the heat, that high blast of heat, helps with the, in essence, oven spring of the quick bread. Because especially when you're making breads with whole grain flours, and especially ancient whole grain flours like Einkorn, Emmer, and Spelt, is that they're more dense and it's more challenging for them to give you a nice rise and a nice crown on your loaf bread. But by giving that blast of heat, it can help initially to assist in the rise. But you can't bake it at that high temperature. You can't even really bake it at 375 degrees Fahrenheit that many loaf breads are baked at. You've got to pull it down to the 350 degree Fahrenheit mark, because at that point, the top will be nice and golden brown and the interior will be cooked. Anything made with 100% whole grain takes a little longer to cook and a little longer to cook thoroughly. And you always want to allow your quick bread the time it needs to thoroughly cook inside, yet without burning on top. Often you'll hear people say, and I've shared this with you too, if you see your bread is browning too quickly, whether it's a quick bread or a yeasted bread or a sourdough bread, you can always tent it. But and that's often you're baking with all-purpose flour and you're baking at 375, whatever the case may be. But generally with whole grain breads, 350 is always going to be, so to speak, the sweet spot to bake your loaf bread, your quick bread. And so you're going to see when we take that out, when it's done, the top will be nice and golden brown and the interior will have a beautiful, delicate crumb, because we did things to assist in helping the einkorn the best we could to give it a nice rise so that it doesn't create a dense loaf. Well, I checked my date nut bread at 50 minutes, 50, and it looked perfect. So I took a toothpick, put it in the middle, and the toothpick came out clean. So I removed my date nut bread from the oven. Now I'm going to use the parchment paper sling. And I'm just going to, I can use both. Either or will work actually, but I think I'll do this so that both come out. And I'm going to just put this over here and I'm going to let that cool. Well, this is still kind of warm, but I think we'll go ahead and slice into it so we can see how the inside came. Now, if you've got a serrated knife, these work great for these loaf breads, especially these whole grain loaf breads. So let me go ahead and cut the end here. The end is always my favorite slice. Well, I'm just so happy with how this came, and for all whole grain and einkorn no less. It's got a beautiful, nice soft interior, soft crumb as they say, not dense. It feels relatively light, but now let's give it a taste. Now, with date nut bread, I really think a little cream cheese works better. I have some butter here too, but I think I'm going to do a little spreadable cream cheese here. If you want a recipe for how to make homemade cream cheese, I'll be sure to link to it below. I shared that with you a while back. Very easy to make. Alrighty. I should say very easy to make a homemade version. It's sort of a mock cream cheese, but it's as close as we can get as home cooks who don't have the machines that they have in the factories that can really put the cultured dairy under pressure. But I have a trick for you. I show you how we can do it the best way possible as home cooks. Alrighty, well, let's give this enough talking, right? And let's give this a taste. Mmm. Mmm. This is really good. Not overly sweet, tender as can be. I mean, it's not dense at all. For all whole grain, I'm really impressed. And the cream cheese, I highly recommend you use cream cheese. It just offers a lovely balance to the dates. You're going to love this. Now, if you want to see the first video in this series where I show you how to make whole grain einkorn muffins, be sure to click on this video over here, and I'll see you over there in my Texas Hill Country kitchen. Love and God bless, and be sure to keep your eye open for more fresh milled baking recipes, fresh milled flour baking recipes.